I never believed in the stories. I always thought they were just tales people told to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. Growing up in a rural part of Wyoming, you hear all kinds of things. Warnings about mountain lions, old superstitions about spirits in the forest, and the occasional hush talk of something far worse. But I had spent my whole life out there, hunting, fishing, hiking. I knew the land better than anything, and I never saw or heard anything that made me think there was something unnatural lurking in the wilderness. That changed in the fall of 2015. I had taken a week off from work to get away from everything. My job had been grinding me down, and I needed the space to clear my head. My grandfather had left me an old cabin deep in the forest, about 30 miles from the nearest town. It wasn't much, just a single-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a small table. But it was quiet, and that was all I wanted. I packed up enough supplies to last me the week, loaded up my truck, and drove out there, expecting nothing more than a peaceful escape. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I spent my time hunting, chopping wood, and sitting out on the porch, listening to the wind move through the trees. The nights were cold, but I had enough firewood to keep the place warm. Everything felt normal, but on the third night, something changed. I had just settled into bed when I heard something outside. It wasn't unusual. There were always animals moving through the trees at night, but this was different. It was slow, deliberate, almost like footsteps. I sat up, listening. The sound moved around the cabin, circling it once before stopping near the front door. I reached for my rifle. I wasn't scared yet, just cautious. I figured it was a bear, maybe a coyote sniffing around. I got up slowly, moving toward the door as quietly as I could. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and as soon as the sound broke the silence, whatever was outside moved too. Quick, heavy steps disappearing into the woods. I stepped onto the porch with my rifle ready, but there was nothing there. Just the wind, the trees, the dark. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked around the cabin for tracks. The ground was damp from the rain earlier that week, and I expected to find some kind of prints in the mud. I found them, but they weren't what I expected. At first glance, they looked like deer tracks, sharp, cloven hoof marks leading from the trees to the porch. But the longer I looked, the more I realized something was wrong. They were too large, too deep, and they didn't follow a normal pattern. Instead of a straight line, they moved side to side, like whatever had made them had been pacing back and forth. Something about it made my stomach turn. I shook it off and went about my day, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping into my chest. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe the wind had shifted my perspective. But that night, the noises came back. This time, they were louder, heavier. I lay in my cot, staring at the ceiling, gripping my rifle. I could hear something moving just beyond the tree line, shuffling through the leaves, stopping, then starting again. I told myself it was an elk, a moose maybe, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Then I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was my name, not spoken, not whispered, but something in between. It was stretched out, broken, like someone trying to remember how to say it. Came from the trees, from the dark. I stopped breathing, called again. The same twisted, mangled version of my name. I didn't move. The footsteps started again, slow, deliberate, coming closer to the cabin. I sat up, my body tense, my heart hammering against my ribs. My hands were shaking, but I kept my grip on the rifle. Then I heard it, the worst part. It knocked on the door. Not a hard knock, not a casual one. Just a light, testing tap like it was seeing if I would answer. I stayed frozen, my mind racing. Every part of me screamed not to move, not to make a sound. The knocking came again, a little harder this time. Then silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. But eventually, the sounds faded, and I heard the slow crunch of footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things, loaded my truck, and didn't look back. But before I left, I forced myself to check the ground outside one last time. The tracks were there, hoof prints just like before. But now there was something else. Handprints. They were deep in the mud, fingers splayed out like something had been crawling. And they weren't human. The proportions were off, too long, too thin. I didn't waste another second. I got in my truck and drove, faster than I ever had before, not stopping until I was miles away. I haven't been back to that cabin since. I won't go near those woods anymore. Some nights, though, I swear I still hear it, just outside my window, calling my name. I've done my fair share of missions. Some go by the book, smooth and clean. Others leave a mark, not just on the body but on the mind. This one was different. It wasn't the worst firefight I'd been in, not the bloodiest raid, but something about that cabin in the woods never left me. It was 2016, early winter, cold enough that your breath curled in front of you, but not enough to freeze your sweat when things got rough. I was part of an Army Special Operations team working with local law enforcement in the northern part of the US. Our mission was simple: take down a group of heavily armed criminals using an old hunting cabin as their base. Intel said they were ex-military, running drugs and weapons through the state, using the deep woods as their route. Smart. Too smart. No one just stumbles on a place that far out unless they mean to. The cabin was miles from the nearest town, sitting in a valley surrounded by thick forest. No roads, no trails, just trees and silence. We moved in at night, hiking for miles through the dark. The plan was simple: surround the place, cut off escape routes, and hit them hard before they knew what was happening. The higher-ups wanted prisoners, but we knew that was wishful thinking. These weren't the kind to surrender. I remember the sound of the wind, the crunch of frozen dirt under our boots, the way our gear shifted with every step. We were ghosts in the trees, moving with purpose. No talking, no unnecessary movement, just focus. The cabin came into view around 0200. It was bigger than expected, 2 floors with a garage attached. Faint light seeped through the windows, flickering like firelight. A single truck was parked out front, covered in mud. No movement outside. We spread out, rifles up, fingers steady on triggers. 2 men covered the back while the rest of us took positions around the front and sides. I kept low near the treeline, heartbeat slow and steady. A few moments passed. No movement inside. Then something felt off. I've done this long enough to know when something isn't right. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. No one moving, no one talking. The kind of silence that shouldn't exist in a place like this. My gut tightened. The signal came. Breach. One of the guys placed a charge on the front door. The blast was quick, controlled, shaking the ground beneath us. We moved in fast, rifles raised, ready for anything. But the place was empty. Empty, but not abandoned. The air was thick, stale. The living room was a mess. Maps, empty cans, a few guns left out. Plates with half-eaten food sat on a small table, as if they'd left in a hurry. A single chair was overturned near the fireplace, the embers still faintly glowing.
No bodies.
No sign of struggle, just gone. We cleared the first floor fast. Kitchen, storage, a small room with a cot and some personal gear. Upstairs was the same. Empty beds, more scattered supplies, a rifle leaning against the wall. Then we found the basement door. It was slightly open, a dark slit leading down into the unknown. No sound, no movement, just cold, stale air drifting up. I went first, slow, controlled, rifle up, scanning every corner. The others followed, moving in tight formation. The basement was bigger than expected, more of a bunker than a storage room. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with supplies, ammo, food, medical gear. Someone had been planning to stay here a long time. Then we saw the blood, a dark smear on the concrete floor, leading toward a back wall. A few spent shell casings lay nearby, gleaming in the dim light.
No bodies.
Just blood. The wall wasn't right. One of the guys knocked on it. Hollow, a hidden door. We forced it open, revealing a narrow tunnel leading deeper underground. Dirt walls, barely wide enough for two men to walk side by side. It stretched forward into darkness, no telling how far. This wasn't just a cabin. They had planned for this. We moved in, flashlights cutting through the pitch black. The tunnel curved slightly, then opened into a larger space. Another room, more supplies, more blood. Then we found the first body. A man, slumped against the wall, rifle in his lap, blood pooling beneath him. A single gunshot to the head, execution style. The second body was further in, sprawled across the floor, his face frozen in a silent scream. Same shot placement, precise. This wasn't a fight, this was a cleanup. We pushed forward, senses razor sharp. Another turn, another room, more bodies. 5 in total, all executed the same way. Some had their hands bound. They never even had a chance. Then we heard it, a faint sound, deeper in the tunnel. A shuffling noise, barely there. Someone was still down here. We moved fast, rifles up, closing the distance in seconds. Another room, a single lantern flickering. A man stood there, breathing heavy, gun in hand. Not one of ours. He turned, eyes wide, face pale. He was older, late 40s maybe, beard streaked with gray. His clothes were stained with blood, not his own. He didn't fire, didn't even try, just stood there, staring at us like he was already dead. His gun lowered, then slipped from his hand. He muttered something under his breath, words we couldn't hear. Then he dropped to his knees. We secured him, pulled him outside. He never said a word, just stared at the trees, breathing slow, like he was finally free. Intel came later. The dead men were his crew. He was their leader. Someone had turned on them, taken them out one by one. But it wasn't us. We never found out who. The case got buried. Higher-ups classified it. Official report said we took down a dangerous group, ended a criminal operation. Mission success. But we knew the truth. Someone else had been there first. Someone who didn't leave witnesses. And whoever they were still out there. We left the cabin behind, but I never forgot that silence. That cold, empty feeling. The way the trees seemed to watch us as we walked away. Some missions stay with you. This was one of them. I didn't want to take the job, but I needed the money. It was late October, and I had just finished a long contract working security for a construction site in town. The work had dried up, and bills were piling up fast. A friend put me in touch with a guy who needed a security guard for a cabin way out in the woods. The job sounded easy. Stay in the cabin overnight, keep an eye on the property, and make sure no one messed with the place. It wasn't even fully built yet, just a foundation, some walls, and a roof. The owner wanted someone there because there had been break-ins in the area, mostly squatters or thieves looking to strip copper wiring. The money was decent. $200 a night, cash in hand. 3 nights of work. It seemed too good to pass up. The cabin was a long drive from the nearest town. I followed the directions, turning off the highway onto a narrow dirt road that twisted through miles of thick forest. It had rained recently, and the road was nothing but deep mud and scattered puddles. My truck struggled in some spots, the tires slipping, but I made it without getting stuck. When I arrived, the place was just as the owner had described. A simple one-room cabin, still unfinished. The roof was on and most of the walls were up, but the interior was mostly bare. No insulation, no electricity, just exposed wooden beams and a single old wood-burning stove in the corner. There was a cot, a folding chair, and a plastic cooler filled with bottled water and some food. I had brought my own gear: a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and my rifle. I didn't expect trouble, but I wasn't taking any chances. The first night was uneventful. I sat in the chair by the stove, listening to the sounds of the woods. The wind rustled through the trees, branches creaked, and once in a while, I heard the distant call of an owl. I walked the perimeter a couple of times, scanning the darkness with my flashlight, but there was nothing out there. No signs of anyone. It was cold, but the stove kept the cabin warm enough. I dozed off in the chair around midnight, waking up every so often to check my surroundings. The second night was different. It started with a noise, a deep, dragging sound just outside the cabin. I snapped awake, my heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the door. The noise stopped. I waited, holding my breath, listening. Nothing. I stood up slowly, moving toward the window. The glass hadn't been installed yet, just an open square cut into the wall. I shined my light outside, sweeping it across the trees. Still nothing. I told myself it was an animal. Maybe a deer moving through the brush, maybe a raccoon digging around. The woods were full of noises at night. I forced myself to relax, sat back down, and poured some coffee from my thermos. An hour later, the noise came back. It was closer this time. A slow, deliberate scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged through the dirt. I grabbed my rifle. I moved toward the door, standing to the side of it, my back pressed against the rough wooden wall. I listened. The sound stopped again, just like before. I waited 5 minutes, 10. Then, cautiously, I cracked the door open and shined my flashlight outside. The ground was wet and soft from the rain, and in the beam of my light, I saw something that made my stomach twist. There were deep, fresh drag marks in the mud. They led from the tree line straight toward the cabin, toward me. I stepped outside, rifle raised, scanning the darkness. The trees loomed tall and silent, their branches swaying in the wind. I moved forward, following the marks with my light. They went on for about 20 feet before disappearing into the underbrush. I wasn't about to go any further. I backed up, keeping my eyes on the tree line, then slipped back inside the cabin and bolted the door. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my rifle on my lap. By morning, I convinced myself it was some animal. Maybe a bear or a large deer dragging its hoofs through the mud. That made sense. It had to be something like that. The third night, I realized I was wrong. It started the same way. The noise, the dragging. But this time, there was something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps moving just beyond the tree line. I killed my flashlight and crouched low, my heart hammering. I listened, straining to hear over the wind. The footsteps were careful, methodical, like someone trying not to be heard. Then they stopped. The woods fell into an unnatural silence. No wind, no rustling leaves, no animal sounds. Then a new sound, breathing, heavy, deliberate breathing, low and slow, not an animal. I tightened my grip on my rifle. My hands were slick with sweat. The breathing stayed in one place, right at the edge of the trees. Then, after what felt like forever, it moved. Closer. I stayed still, barely even breathing. The sound stopped right outside the cabin, just beyond the door. And then scraping. Long, slow scraping against the wooden planks of the cabin, like something was dragging its nails across the surface. I lifted my rifle, aiming toward the door. I had no intention of opening it. Then the handle moved, a slow, steady twist, testing the lock. My blood turned to ice. I stood up, forcing myself to move as quietly as possible. I took position by the door, aiming my rifle, finger on the trigger. Then silence. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. I finally turned on my flashlight and shined it out the window. There was no one there, but the drag marks were back. Deep, fresh gouges in the mud. This time, they weren't leading to the cabin. They were leading away, into the woods. I didn't stay until morning. I grabbed my gear, threw it in my truck, and drove out of there as fast as I could. I never told the owner what happened. I never even called him to say I wasn't coming back. I left town a few weeks later, took a job in another state, and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying awake in bed, I think about that sound. The slow, deliberate dragging in the mud, and the heavy breathing just outside the door. I used to think I understood fear, the kind of fear you feel when walking alone at night, the kind that creeps up your spine when you hear an unfamiliar sound in your house. But what I experienced that night in the woods, in that old cabin, showed me a kind of fear I never thought was real. The kind of fear that doesn't let you breathe, that doesn't let you think, that makes every second stretch into an eternity. It happened in 2014 in the forests of Montana. I had taken a week off work to get away from everything. I wasn't a big city guy, but life had dragged me into one, and I needed space, silence, and distance from people. A buddy of mine had a family cabin out in the woods, and when I told him I needed a break, he offered me the place without hesitation. He even warned me, jokingly, that there was no cell service and that the place was so deep in the woods even GPS got confused. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my truck with enough supplies for a week: food, a rifle for hunting, a handgun for safety, a few books, and a couple of old notebooks to jot things down. I wasn't expecting trouble. The worst I figured I might run into was a bear or a coyote sniffing around for food. The drive up was peaceful, at least for a while. The roads were quiet, the air crisp, the sky shifting from blue to deep orange as the sun started setting behind the trees. As I got closer to the cabin, the road turned from gravel to dirt, winding through dense forest. There was something unsettling about how dark it got between the trees, how quiet everything became. The moment I stepped out of the truck, I felt it, the kind of silence that shouldn't be there. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves, just stillness. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, a single-story structure with a small porch, a slanted roof, and wooden walls darkened by years of exposure to the elements. The inside was simple: one main room with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, a small bedroom, and a bathroom. The place smelled like wood and dust, exactly what I expected. I settled in quickly, unpacked, started a fire, heated up some canned stew, and sat on the porch in the darkness, listening. The first night was uneventful, though I kept waking up to check the time. The cabin had an old wind-up clock on the wall, and the ticking seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. The second day, I spent my time exploring. I hiked through the trees, rifle slung over my shoulder, taking in the untouched wilderness. The forest was dense, the kind that made you feel small, made you realize how easy it would be to get lost if you weren't careful. That's when I found something strange. About 2 miles from the cabin, there was another structure, smaller, more broken down. It looked abandoned, but the door was missing, and inside, I could see an old wooden table, a rusted-out stove, and something that made my stomach turn. A pile of bones in the corner. Not human, at least I didn't think so, but something had been eating there, and recently. The ground was disturbed, the dirt packed down by footprints. Large, heavy footprints. Someone had been here. I left quickly, marking the way back to my cabin carefully. That night, the feeling of being watched crept in. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just my nerves or the isolation messing with me. But then I started hearing it. Movement. Slow, deliberate footsteps outside the cabin. I froze, listening, heart hammering. Then nothing. I grabbed my handgun and flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, aiming into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only empty woods. No animals, no people, just stillness. I barely slept that night. The third day, I went back to the abandoned cabin, this time in the daylight. I found more footprints, some overlapping mine from the previous day, meaning whoever was there had come back. I followed them a little, but they vanished into the woods. That night, the noises came again. Footsteps, closer this time, slow, careful. Then a soft tap on the window. I nearly stopped breathing. I turned my head so slowly it hurt, staring at the window. Nothing, just darkness. I didn't move. I sat there, gripping my gun so tightly my fingers went numb. The tapping came again on a different window. Whoever was out there was playing with me. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, gun in hand, eyes locked on the door. By morning, the ground outside was covered in footprints. Large ones, circling the cabin, stopping at the windows. Someone had been there all night. I had enough. I packed my things, ready to leave. But as I reached my truck, I froze. The hood was open. The engine ripped apart. Wires cut. I was stranded. Panic set in, but I forced myself to think. There was a radio in the cabin, old but functional. If I could get a message out, maybe someone would hear me. I locked the doors, shoved furniture against them, and tried the radio. Static. Nothing but static. Then a voice. Not speaking. Breathing. Heavy, slow breathing. I turned it off. That night, the tapping returned. Then the doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to get in. I aimed my gun at the door, finger on the trigger, but they never forced their way in. They just wanted me to know they were there. The hours dragged by, the fire burning low. And then, just before dawn, a sound that made my stomach drop. The front door creaked. It wasn't locked anymore. I didn't move. I stayed perfectly still, gripping my gun, heart pounding so hard I thought I would pass out. The door opened just an inch, then another. I fired. The shot echoed through the cabin, deafening in the silence. The door slammed shut, and I heard footsteps, fast and heavy, running into the woods. Morning came, and I forced myself outside. The footprints were everywhere, but no blood, no sign I had hit anything. I didn't waste time. I grabbed what I could carry and started walking. The nearest town was over 15 miles away, but I didn't care. I walked all day, never stopping, never looking back. By nightfall, I reached a road. A truck stopped, an old farmer behind the wheel. I must have looked like hell because he didn't ask many questions, just took me to town. I told the police everything. They went to the cabin, found the damage, the footprints, even the abandoned shack. But no person, no sign of who had been there. The cabin still stands. My friend offered to let me go back. I never did. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. They weren't just passing through. They were waiting. I don't know what made me take the job. Maybe it was the pay. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was just because I needed to get away from everything for a while. It was late September when I agreed to look after an old hunting cabin in the northern part of England. The owner, a man in his late 50s, had inherited the place from his father, but he rarely used it. He had gotten in touch with me through a friend of a friend, asking if I'd be interested in looking after the place for a few weeks. Just basic maintenance, keeping an eye on things, making sure no one messed with the property. The cabin was a little over 2 miles from the nearest road, buried deep in the woods. No power, no running water, just a wood-burning stove, a well out back, and a gas lantern for light. It was the kind of place that most people would avoid in the colder months, but that didn't bother me. I liked the quiet. I had spent most of my 20s working in remote locations, handling maintenance jobs for people with money. I wasn't the kind of person who needed company. I drove up on a Wednesday, my truck loaded with supplies. The road turned to dirt about a mile before I reached the gate. From there, it was a rough, uneven path through the woods, branches scraping against the sides of the truck as I eased my way through. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, it was just as I'd expected. Weathered wood, a slanted roof, a small porch with an old rocking chair that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The inside was basic. A single room with a bed against the wall, a wood-burning stove in the corner, a small table, and a few chairs. There were hunting rifles mounted above the fireplace, but they looked more like decorations than anything useful. The shelves were lined with old canned goods, most of them expired. The whole place smelled like damp wood and dust. I settled in quickly, unpacking my things, stacking firewood near the stove. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but I hadn't expected it to be. I spent the first couple of days clearing out some of the overgrown brush near the well, patching up a few holes in the walls where mice had chewed through. The weather was starting to shift, the nights getting colder, the wind rattling the trees outside. The first time I saw her, it was just a glimpse. It was late, maybe close to midnight. I had been outside, throwing some wood onto the fire pit when I saw movement near the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but then I saw the shape of a person. A woman. She was standing just beyond the firelight, half hidden in the shadows. She didn't move. I stood there for a few seconds, staring, trying to figure out if my eyes were playing tricks on me. Then, as I took a step forward, she turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't follow. It wasn't uncommon for hikers to pass through the area. I figured she had just wandered too close and had seen the fire. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she had been camping nearby and had gotten curious. Either way, I didn't think much of it at the time. The next morning, I walked to the spot where I had seen her. The ground was damp, the grass flattened in places, but there were no footprints. The trees stretched out in every direction, thick and tangled, with no clear path leading away from where she had been standing. I stood there for a while, listening to the wind in the trees, but there was nothing. That night, I saw her again. I was inside, reading by the light of the gas lantern when I heard something outside, a soft rustling, like someone stepping through the leaves. I set the book down, stood up, and moved to the window. She was there, standing in the clearing just beyond the porch, facing the cabin. She was wearing a long coat, the hood pulled up over her head, her face barely visible in the dim light. I didn't move. I just stood there, watching her, waiting for her to do something. But she didn't. She just stood there, her body still, her hands at her sides. I reached for the rifle mounted above the fireplace, my fingers curling around the barrel. I didn't want to use it, but I wanted her to know I had it. I turned back to the window. She was gone. The next few nights were the same. I would hear something outside. I would look. She would be there, always at a distance, never moving, never coming any closer. I started keeping the rifle next to the bed. During the day, I searched the woods, looking for any sign of where she had come from. But there was nothing. No campsites, no footprints, no paths leading anywhere. It was like she just appeared when the sun went down. The more I saw her, the more unsettled I became. I started sleeping with the lantern on, the rifle within arm's reach. I stopped going outside at night. I kept the doors locked. I told myself it was just some local woman who had gone off the grid, someone who lived out in the woods and didn't want to be found. Then one night, everything changed. It was just past midnight when I woke up. The fire had burned low, the room filled with shadows. The wind was howling outside, the trees creaking under the weight of the storm. And then I heard it, not outside, inside. A soft creak, like a footstep on old wood. I reached for the rifle, my heart hammering in my chest. I sat up slowly, scanning the room, the dim light from the lantern casting long, shifting shadows against the walls. There was nothing. I swung my legs over the bed, gripping the rifle tight. And then I saw her. She was standing in the corner of the room. Not outside, inside. I don't know how she got in. The door was locked. The windows were shut. But she was there, her face hidden by the hood, her body motionless. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand. She pointed at the fireplace. I didn't know what to do. Then she turned, walked to the door, and opened it. The wind howled through the cabin, sending a shiver down my spine. And then she was gone. The door swung shut behind her. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care about the job. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted to leave. But before I left, I checked the fireplace. The bricks were loose. I pulled them out one by one. Behind them, buried deep in the wall, was something wrapped in an old cloth. I unwrapped it. Bones. Small bones. Human. I don't know who they belonged to. I don't know how long they had been there. But I knew one thing. She had been trying to tell me. I left that day. I never went back. And I never saw her again. I never liked staying at the cabin alone. It wasn't that I was scared of the woods or being by myself. Years of hunting had taught me to be comfortable in solitude. But there was something about that place, something that always made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way the trees pressed in so close, or the way the wind howled through the valley, making it sound like something was whispering just out of earshot. Or maybe it was just the memories. The cabin had been in my family for years, built by my grandfather long before I was born. It sat deep in the woods of Montana, far from any main roads or towns. You had to take a dirt trail for miles just to reach it, and once you were there, you were completely cut off from the rest of the world. No cell service, no internet, just miles of thick forest and the occasional sound of an animal moving through the underbrush. I had been coming here since I was a kid, first with my dad and uncles, then later on my own. Hunting had always been a tradition in my family, something passed down through generations. My dad used to say that being out in the wild was the only way to truly feel alive. I agreed with him for the most part, but this trip was different. This time I was alone. It wasn't my original plan. I was supposed to come up with my buddy Eric, but he had backed out at the last minute because of work. I had debated canceling the trip, but I had already packed everything, and I figured a few days in the woods would do me good. I hadn't been up to the cabin in over a year, and I was looking forward to getting away from everything. The drive up was uneventful, just miles of empty road and scattered pine trees. The last stretch was the worst. A narrow dirt trail that wound its way up the mountain, barely wide enough for my truck. It had rained the night before, and the road was slick with mud. More than once, I felt my tires slip, and I had to grip the wheel tighter to keep from sliding off the edge. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The place looked the same as I remembered, small, weathered, with a steep roof and a stone chimney. There was a woodpile stacked against the side, covered with a tarp, and the old metal fire pit out front was half buried in leaves. I parked the truck and climbed out, stretching my legs. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. It was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, pressing down on you. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the rustling of the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. I grabbed my gear from the truck and carried it inside. The cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchen, a table, and a couple of old chairs. A narrow doorway led to the bedroom in the back, where there was a twin bed with a lumpy mattress and an old wooden dresser. The walls were lined with hunting trophies, mostly deer heads mounted on wooden plaques. My grandfather had been proud of his kills, and my dad had added a few of his own over the years. I set my rifle down on the table and went about unpacking. First, I checked the generator. It was old but still worked, giving me enough power for the small lights and the mini fridge. I started a fire in the wood stove, the warmth slowly seeping into the cabin, pushing out the chill that had settled in. Then I grabbed a beer from the cooler and stepped outside, watching as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the trees. That first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, sat by the fire for a while, and then turned in early. The bed was uncomfortable, but I was used to it. I slept with my rifle close by, just like I always did when I was out in the woods alone. Not because I was scared, just because it was smart. The next morning, I woke early, before the sun had fully risen. The air was cold, and a thin layer of frost covered the ground outside. I made some coffee on the old propane stove, packed a small bag, and headed out. I had planned to spend the day tracking deer, maybe even bag one if I was lucky. I walked for hours, moving quietly through the trees, scanning the ground for tracks. The forest was thick, the kind of place where it was easy to lose your bearings if you weren't paying attention. But I knew these woods. I had grown up in them. Around midday, I found fresh tracks near a small clearing. The ground was soft from the recent rain, and I could see where the deer had passed through. I followed the trail, moving slowly, carefully. After about 20 minutes, I spotted it, a large buck grazing near the edge of the trees. I raised my rifle, steadying my breath. Just as I was about to take the shot, something moved in the distance, a flicker of motion just beyond the trees. I hesitated, lowering my rifle slightly. It had been quick, barely more than a shadow, but it had been there. At first, I thought it might be another deer, but something about it felt off. I waited, listening, but the forest was silent. Too silent. The buck must have sensed something too, because it lifted its head, ears twitching. A few seconds later, it bolted, disappearing into the trees. I cursed under my breath and lowered my rifle completely. I stayed there for a moment, scanning the woods, but I didn't see anything else. Eventually, I turned back toward the cabin, figuring I could try again later. The walk back felt different. The air was heavier, the trees somehow darker. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me, but I picked up my pace anyway. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to set. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and started a fire. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it lingered, settling deep in my chest. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise outside made me sit up, gripping my rifle tight. I kept thinking about that movement in the woods, about the way the deer had reacted. Something had been out there, something I couldn't explain. The next morning, I found tracks near the cabin. Not deer tracks. These were different, larger, human. But something about them wasn't right. The shape was off, the stride too long. I followed them for a few yards before they disappeared into the underbrush. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where they vanished. My stomach was tight, my mind racing. There was no reason for anyone else to be out here. No roads, no trails, just miles of dense forest. I spent the rest of the day on edge, rifle in hand. I didn't go far from the cabin. I didn't hunt. That night, I heard something. A sound outside, soft but deliberate. Footsteps, slow, heavy. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The sound circled the cabin once, then stopped. I gripped my rifle so tight my knuckles ached. Then, after what felt like hours, it was gone. I left the next morning, packed up, loaded my gear, and drove out as fast as the muddy road would let me. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I never went back to that cabin again. I hadn't been back to the cabin since my husband passed. Not once. It had been sitting out there in the woods, untouched, just the way he had left it. I didn't even know why I finally decided to go back. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was just time. But when I turned onto that old dirt road, I felt the weight of everything settle onto my chest like a boulder. The drive was longer than I remembered, the road rougher. It had rained the night before, and the tires kicked up mud as I wound my way deeper into the forest. The trees stretched overhead, dark and thick, blocking out most of the late afternoon light. It was early autumn, and the air had that crisp edge to it, but in these woods it always felt a little colder. The cabin finally came into view through the trees. It looked the same: weathered wood, metal roof, the old porch where he used to sit and drink his coffee in the mornings. But something about it felt different, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I parked a few yards away, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no wind rustling through the leaves. Just silence. I got out of the truck and stood there for a moment, just looking at the place. The door was still locked, the windows shut tight, but I had this strange feeling, like someone had been there. I shook it off and walked up the porch steps. The key was still in the same spot under the loose board to the right of the door. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the smell of wood. Everything was exactly how we'd left it. His old jacket was still hanging on the back of the chair. His boots were by the door. The sink still had an old coffee mug sitting in it, as if he had just been here yesterday. I stood there for a while, taking it all in, before I finally walked through the cabin. I opened the windows to let some air in. I ran my fingers over the books on the shelf, the old hunting knife on the table. I felt like an intruder in my own place. I wasn't planning to stay long. I just wanted to check on it, maybe grab a few things. But as I walked back to the door, I stopped. Something was off. The feeling hit me hard, like I wasn't alone. I turned my head slowly, listening. Nothing, just my own breathing. I shook it off again. It was just nerves. But then I noticed something. The back door. It was locked, but the latch was different. It wasn't how we left it. My stomach nodded. I walked over, checking the lock. It was old and rusted, but someone had tampered with it. Scratches around the keyhole. Someone had tried to get in. I swallowed hard and backed away. My first thought was to leave, to get in my truck and never come back. But then I saw something on the floor near the kitchen. Something that hadn't been there before. A boot print. It wasn't mine. It was fresh. A chill ran down my spine. I turned quickly, scanning the room. Every shadow felt deeper. Every creak of the old wood more sinister. I felt like I was being watched. I rushed back to the front door, ready to leave. But as soon as I stepped onto the porch, I froze. There were tracks in the dirt, leading away from the house. Someone had been here, and they had been watching me. My hands were shaking as I locked the cabin back up. I walked fast, almost running, to my truck. I didn't even look back. I got in, started the engine, and threw it into reverse. I drove faster than I should have, my heart hammering in my chest. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing in the road, watching me. But there was nothing, just trees and the fading light. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until I hit the main road. Only then did I pull over, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I sat there, breathing hard, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew the truth. Someone had been at that cabin, and they weren't just passing through. They had been waiting. had no reason to distrust him. He was a cop, a man of the law, someone who swore to serve and protect. But that night, out in the middle of nowhere, inside that old wooden cabin, I learned the hard way that a badge doesn't make someone good. It started with a favor, a simple one. "Watch the place for me," he had said. "Just for a night or two. Keep an eye on things." I didn't ask too many questions. Maybe I should have. Maybe that would have saved me. But at the time, it didn't seem like a big deal. The cabin was deep in the woods, tucked away from the main road, and according to him, rarely used. Just a spot he owned. A hunting cabin, he had called it. I had been looking for some peace and quiet, a place to clear my head. So I agreed. I packed light, just some food, water, a flashlight, and my old hunting rifle. I wasn't expecting trouble, but being alone in the woods, it just made sense to bring it. The drive out there was long, winding through back roads and dirt paths. By the time I arrived, the sun was already setting, stretching shadows long across the ground. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. Wooden walls, a slanted tin roof, one front door, and two small windows covered with dust. Looked like no one had been here for months. Inside, it was simple. One large room with a cot, a table, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in ages. There were old cans of food stacked in a corner, a hunting knife stuck in the wood of the table, and dust floating in the air. Smelled like old wood, damp and stale. I got the fire going first, not because it was cold, but because it made the place feel a little less empty. Then I set up my sleeping bag on the cot and ate a can of beans straight out of the tin. I was settling in, thinking about how I'd spend the next couple of days, when I heard it, a car, the sound of tires on gravel, slow, rolling to a stop outside. I set my food down, stood up, and listened. A door creaked open, then shut. Heavy boots on the ground. Slow, deliberate steps toward the cabin. Then knocking. It was him, the cop. I didn't expect him back so soon. I figured maybe he was coming to check in, or maybe he forgot something. I opened the door, and he stood there, bathed in the dim glow of my fire, his uniform hidden beneath a heavy jacket. Something felt off. He stepped inside without asking, walked past me, looked around, then turned to face me. There was something in his eyes, a tension in his face. I asked him if everything was okay. He didn't answer right away, just stood there, looking at me like he was deciding something. Then he spoke, told me he needed my help, said there was a problem, a serious one, said that someone had found something they shouldn't have. I asked him what he meant. He didn't explain. He just looked at me, long and hard, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it out to me, and when I took it, my hands felt cold. It was a picture, a body, face down in the dirt, blood pooled around the head, clothes ripped and dirty, and I knew the place, the clearing about a mile from the cabin. I looked up at him. My mouth felt dry, my chest tight. He told me there was no going back, that I knew too much now, and then he reached for his gun. I didn't think. I just reacted. I shoved him back, hard, knocking him into the table. The hunting knife wobbled in the wood. I turned to run, but he was fast, faster than I thought he'd be. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground, face scraping against the rough wooden floor, his knee pressing into my back. I struggled, but he was stronger. Then I heard it, the hammer of his pistol clicking back. I wasn't going to die like that. I twisted, throwing my elbow back into his ribs. He grunted, lost his balance for just a second, long enough for me to roll free. I scrambled to my feet, ran for the cot where my rifle rested. My fingers closed around the stock just as he fired. The shot rang out, deafening inside the cabin, which splintered near my head. I spun around, raised my rifle, but he was already lunging. We crashed together, the rifle caught between us. His hands clawed at my throat. I felt the cold metal of his gun press into my ribs. I fought with everything I had. The fire crackled beside us. The smell of burning wood filled the air. We hit the table, knocking it over. The hunting knife clattered to the floor. He went for it. I went for the gun. For a moment, everything froze. Then another gunshot. He staggered. Blood bloomed across his chest. His fingers loosened. His knees buckled. He hit the floor hard, eyes wide, mouth open in shock. His breathing was wet, ragged. He tried to speak, but no words came out. I stood there, the gun still raised, my hands shaking. Then he stopped breathing. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at his body. The fire popped, sending embers drifting through the air. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Then I moved. I grabbed what little I had and ran. Out the door, into the woods, my boots crunching against the undergrowth. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just ran deeper into the dark, away from that cabin, away from what I had done. The road was far, but I made it. By the time I reached my truck, the night was silent. I left that place behind, drove until the sky started to lighten, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. I didn't call the police. Who would I tell? The only cop who knew I was out there was dead, and I wasn't sticking around to explain, so I kept driving, and I never went back. It was supposed to be an easy job, a few weeks of hard work in the middle of nowhere, building a small hunting cabin for a client who had more money than sense. The land was miles from the nearest town, deep in the woods where no one would bother him. I didn't ask questions, he paid well, and I needed the work. I had done jobs like this before, out in remote areas where the only sound was the wind through the trees. Usually I had a crew with me, but for this job it was just me and another guy named Paul. He was a good worker, quiet, didn't complain much. We had started the project 2 weeks ago, and for the most part it had gone fine. The frame was up, the roof was nearly finished, and we were set to install the windows and doors soon. The rain had been a problem, though. It had rained almost every day since we arrived, soaking everything, making the ground a muddy mess. The client wanted the job done fast, so we worked late most nights, using floodlights powered by a generator. I didn't like working in the dark out there. Something about being surrounded by nothing but trees and blackness put me on edge. But money was money, and I wasn't going to turn it down. That night, the rain was worse than usual. It came down in sheets, hammering against the partially built cabin. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the branches so hard it sounded like something was moving out there. I told myself it was just the storm, just the wind, but I didn't like the feeling in my gut. Paul had already gone to bed in his tent, saying he was too tired to keep working. I didn't blame him. The rain had drained the life out of us. Everything we touched was soaked, and the cold was creeping into my bones. But I wanted to get a little more done before calling it a night. I stayed under the unfinished roof, using the overhang to keep some of the rain off me. I was installing the last of the plywood panels on the walls, hammering nails into the wood while the wind roared. Every few minutes, I had to stop and shake the water from my hands. The floodlights cast long shadows, making the trees look like they were closing in. I tried to ignore it. The generator sputtered once, then twice. I stopped hammering and looked over at it. It was still running, but the lights flickered. That had happened a few times before, usually when the rain got too heavy. I turned back to my work, but the feeling wouldn't go away. That nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. It didn't make sense. Paul was asleep, and there wasn't another soul for miles. But still, I felt it. I forced myself to keep working. I told myself I was being paranoid. But then, over the sound of the rain, I heard something else. Footsteps, not loud, but unmistakable. Slow, careful, moving through the mud just beyond the tree line. I froze, my hammer still in my hand. I stared out into the darkness, but the rain and the glare from the floodlights made it impossible to see anything past the first few trees. I waited, listening. The rain drummed against the wood. The wind moaned through the trees, but the footsteps were gone. I told myself it had to be an animal. A deer, maybe, coyote, but something about it felt wrong. I went back to work, but I was moving faster now, rushing to get done. The rain picked up again, coming down in thick sheets. The wind howled even louder. The generator coughed, and the floodlights flickered again. I kept hammering, trying to ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. Then, another sound. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. I didn't know how I could hear it over the storm, but I could. Low, steady, close. I turned sharply, my heart hammering in my chest. My eyes darted across the tree line, searching for movement. But there was nothing. Just trees swaying violently in the wind, branches creaking, rain slamming into the mud. I stepped away from the wall I was working on, my boots sinking into the wet ground. I scanned the woods, my breath coming fast. The lights flickered again, and for a brief second, the darkness swallowed everything. When they came back on, I saw it. A figure, standing just inside the tree line. Not moving, not speaking, just standing there. The rain blurred my vision, but I knew it wasn't Paul. It was too tall, too thin, and it wasn't moving like someone lost or looking for help. It was just standing, watching. My stomach twisted into knots. I felt a cold dread settle in my chest. I took a slow step back toward the cabin, gripping the hammer tighter in my hand. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. The generator sputtered again. The lights flickered. The wind screamed through the trees. Then the lights went out. Pitch black. The rain roared in my ears. The wind ripped through the trees. I fumbled for my flashlight, my fingers numb from the cold. I switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I aimed it at the tree line. The figure was gone. My breath came fast and shallow. I swept the flashlight across the trees, but there was nothing there, just shadows and rain. I told myself to get to the tent, wake Paul, pack up, and leave. But something kept me frozen in place. A sound, a whisper, not words, just a low, breathy sound, too close, too real. I turned sharply, flashing the light behind me. Nothing. I didn't wait any longer. I sprinted to the tent, my boots slipping in the mud. I nearly crashed into it, yanking the zipper down. Paul stirred, groggy, annoyed, but I didn't stop to explain. I grabbed my bag, my keys, my jacket. Paul finally sat up, confused, but I just told him we had to go. Now, he must have seen something in my face because he didn't argue. He grabbed his stuff, and within minutes, we were running through the rain toward my truck. I didn't look back, didn't check the trees again. I just drove. The road was nearly washed out from the rain, but I didn't care. I kept driving, hands tight on the wheel, heart pounding. We didn't stop until we hit the main road, miles away. We sat there for a long time, rain hammering against the windshield. Paul asked me what happened. I didn't have an answer. We never went back to finish the job. The client called angry, but we didn't care. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know it was watching me, and I know it wasn't human. I never thought I'd spend a night in a place like that. It wasn't my plan. But when things go wrong in the middle of nowhere, sometimes you don't have a choice. It was late October, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones if you're not moving. I was driving through the back roads of northern Montana, heading toward the small town of Deering. I had taken a few days off work, just wanting to get away from everything. The stress of city life had been weighing me down, and I figured some time in the wilderness would help clear my head. The road stretched through dense forest, trees packed so tight they looked like a black wall against the fading daylight. I had been driving for hours, the hum of the engine the only sound in the quiet. My plan was simple: find a cheap motel in town, grab something hot to eat, and get some rest before heading into the mountains the next morning. Then my truck started acting up. At first, it was just a slight hesitation when I pressed the gas. Nothing too alarming. But a few minutes later, the engine sputtered, the headlights flickered, and just like that, the truck lost power completely. I coasted to the side of the road, tried turning the key, but the engine just clicked uselessly. The fuel gauge was fine. No warning lights before it died. Just dead. I checked my phone, no signal. Not surprising out here. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped outside. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees with a low, hollow sound. I looked up and down the road, but there were no headlights in either direction. That's when I noticed the cabin. It was set back off the road, partially hidden by trees. No lights, no smoke from a chimney, but it was shelter. I didn't have much choice. If I stayed in the truck, I'd freeze before morning. I climbed over the shallow ditch, making my way toward the cabin. The place looked abandoned. The wooden walls were gray with age, the windows boarded up in places. The door was slightly open, just enough to creak when the wind pushed against it. I hesitated before stepping inside. The place smelled of old wood and damp earth. My flashlight beam swept over the dust-covered floor, revealing broken furniture and scattered debris. There was an old table near the fireplace, chairs tipped over beside it. Against the far wall was a narrow cot with a stained mattress. The place was empty, but it felt off. I walked further in, my boots crunching on dirt and broken glass. The fireplace was filled with ashes, but they were cold. I checked the kitchen area, empty cabinets, rusted sink. The only thing in the fridge was an old glass jar filled with something dark and unrecognizable. I shut the door quickly. There was no sign of recent life. No food, no clothes, no personal items. But the door had been open. I pushed that thought away. Maybe hunters used it from time to time. Maybe a storm had forced someone in. I wasn't going to stand outside in the cold wondering about it. I gathered some firewood from the small pile near the fireplace and got a fire going. The warmth was immediate, but it didn't settle my nerves. I had that feeling you get when someone's watching you, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up. I ignored it. I set my flashlight on the table and checked my watch. Almost midnight. I figured I'd wait until morning, then hike back to the main road and hope someone passed by. I was just starting to doze off when I heard something outside. A slow, deliberate sound, crunching leaves. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't the wind. The steps were too steady, too heavy. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it off. The fire cast enough light to see, but I didn't want to draw attention. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening. A minute passed, then another. Nothing. Maybe it was an animal. A deer, a coyote, something passing through. Then the door creaked. It was barely a sound, but in the silence it was enough. I turned my flashlight back on and aimed it at the door. Nothing. Just the empty doorway and the dark woods beyond. I forced myself to breathe. Maybe the wind had caught the door again. Maybe the old hinges had shifted. I was convincing myself of that when I noticed something. The dust on the floor near the door was disturbed. A set of footprints. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet. I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't seen any tracks outside when I walked in. Whoever made them had come after me. I slowly reached for my backpack, keeping my eyes on the door. I had a knife in one of the side pockets. Nothing much, but enough to make me feel like I wasn't defenseless. Then, from the back of the cabin, I heard the soft creak of a floorboard. I wasn't alone. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam only caught the edge of the doorway leading to a small back room. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond it. I stood up slowly. The fire popped behind me, the only other sound in the cabin. Then, from the darkness of the back room, something moved. A shadow, a shape. Someone was standing there. My grip on the knife tightened. I didn't speak, didn't ask who they were. I took a step back. So did they. Then, without a sound, they bolted. I heard bare feet slapping against the wood, the door banging open, footsteps racing into the night. I ran to the doorway, shining my light into the trees, but there was nothing, just the sound of branches snapping in the distance. I wasn't going to wait around for them to come back. I grabbed my backpack, stomped out the fire, and left. I didn't care how cold it was. I wasn't staying. I walked back to my truck as fast as I could, my breath fogging in the air. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and gripped the knife in my lap. I sat there for hours, waiting for the first light of dawn. By morning, the truck started like nothing had ever been wrong. I didn't question it. I didn't look back at the cabin. I drove straight into town, stopped at the first gas station, and asked the old guy behind the counter if he knew anything about the place. He just looked at me for a long time before shaking his head. "People go missing near there," he finally said. "Shouldn't be out there alone." I never went back, and I never should have stopped. I never planned on staying in that cabin. It was the kind of place you pass by without a second thought, something forgotten in the woods, the kind of place that shouldn't be there. I wouldn't have stayed if I had a choice, but things don't always go the way you expect. It was late September, early evening, when I took the wrong turn. I had been driving for hours, trying to beat the coming storm, the sky a thick blanket of gray that made it feel later than it was. I had a full tank, my phone was charged, and my GPS had been working fine all day. Then, just like that, everything stopped making sense. The road I was on wasn't on the map. It wasn't like I had wandered onto some back road by mistake. I had been following a main highway, cutting through a stretch of forest that should have taken me right to the next town. But as the trees thickened, the pavement disappeared beneath my tires, turning into rough gravel, then dirt, then something worse than dirt, soft, spongy earth that looked like it hadn't been driven on in years. By the time I realized I was lost, I was already too far in. My GPS flickered between an error message and a spinning wheel. No signal, no service, no way to know where I was or how to turn back. I should have stopped right there. I should have taken a breath, thought about what I was doing, and maybe even turned around before it got too late. But I didn't. I kept going. The road was barely visible in the headlights, just enough of a trail to let me believe I was still heading somewhere. I drove slower, watching the trees press in closer, their branches reaching out like they could pull me from the road if I stopped for too long. Then I saw the fence. It came out of nowhere, a wall of rusted metal bars and stone pillars, half covered in vines. Beyond it, the land opened up, a sloping field of dead grass leading to an old, overgrown cemetery. The gravestones were cracked and leaning, some barely standing, swallowed by thick weeds. The road split off here, a single path leading through the gate and into the dark. I didn't want to go in. I should have backed out, turned around, tried to retrace my steps. But the second I hit reverse, my tires sank into the mud. I was stuck. I got out, tested the ground, tried to see if I could push myself free, but there was no use. The rain had softened the dirt just enough to swallow my back tires. That was when I saw the cabin. It sat just past the graveyard, at the edge of the trees, barely visible through the tangled mess of branches and vines. It looked abandoned, the wood dark with age, the roof sagging in places where the rain had beaten it down over time. A single window caught the last of the light, a faint reflection of the coming storm. I told myself I had two choices: stay in the car and wait for morning, or see if the cabin had something I could use. A shovel, dry ground, anything to get me back on the road. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking. The cemetery was worse up close. The ground was uneven, soft beneath my boots, like it had been dug up and left unfinished. The air smelled stale, thick with the kind of damp that clung to old wood and rotting leaves. I stepped over broken headstones, the names worn down by time, some so faded I couldn't even read them. The cabin's door was open, not wide open, just cracked, like someone had pushed it too hard once and the hinges never fully closed again. I hesitated at the threshold, shining my light inside. Dust floated in the beam, the air inside thicker than outside, like it had been trapped for years. The floorboards were warped and uneven, the walls covered in patches of peeling paint. I stepped inside. It wasn't big. One room, a small cot against the far wall, a wooden table in the center, a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. There were old tools scattered on the floor, an axe with a rusted blade, a coil of rope, a set of nails in a broken box. I took another step, and the door swung shut behind me. It wasn't the wind. The air was dead still, the storm not yet close enough to shake the trees. But something had moved. I turned, expecting to see an animal, maybe a raccoon or something that had been hiding in the rafters. But there was nothing, just the empty cabin. I told myself it was the shift in air pressure, that old houses creak and groan with time. I walked toward the cot, testing the frame. It was solid enough. It would be better than sleeping in the car. That was when I saw the footprints. They were faint, almost hidden beneath the dust, but they were there, dragged patterns like someone had walked in circles near the door over and over. They weren't mine. I stepped back, shining my flashlight toward the far corner of the room. The shadows shifted, stretching with the movement of the light, but there was nothing there. I turned toward the door. It didn't open. I pulled harder. The handle wouldn't budge. It wasn't locked, but something was keeping it from moving. I heard the floor creak behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight toward the cot, the fireplace, the empty corners. Nothing. Just the cabin. Just the dust. Just the sound of my own breathing, too loud in the quiet. I grabbed the axe. Felt wrong in my hands, the weight uneven, the handle smooth from years of use. I gripped it tight, listening, waiting. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, pressing against my ears. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. No wind, no movement. It just opened. I didn't wait. I stepped out, flashlight cutting through the dark, my boots sinking into the wet ground. The graveyard stretched out ahead of me, quiet, still. I didn't look back. I walked fast, then ran, slipping in the mud, barely catching myself before I hit the ground. I reached my car, yanked the door open, slammed it shut behind me. I twisted the key. The engine roared to life. The wheels spun, mud flying, the tires catching just enough traction to pull me free. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just drove, the cemetery fading in my rear view, the cabin disappearing into the dark. When I hit the highway, my GPS came back. The road was there again, just as it had been before, like nothing had ever been wrong. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't want to know if the cabin was still there. I just kept driving, and I never went back. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that part of the woods again. Even thinking about it makes my stomach knot up. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just a couple of guys getting away from the city for a weekend, hitting the trails, eating big meals, and pushing through some bodyweight workouts in the fresh air. That was the plan. But things don't always go as planned. I met Logan at the gym about a year before the trip. He was one of those guys who always showed up, no matter what. No excuses, no skipping days, just hard work. We ended up talking between sets one day, realizing we had the same mindset when it came to training. From there, we started lifting together. We pushed each other, set goals, and made progress. Outside of the gym, we hung out occasionally, grabbing meals or watching fights, but this would be our first trip together. He mentioned the cabin once or twice before. It belonged to his uncle way out in the woods. It was deep in the mountains, far from any towns. No cell service, no internet. Just a small wooden cabin with a fireplace, a kitchen, and 2 rooms with old bunk beds. There was a well outside for water and a generator if we really needed power, but the plan was to rough it. Logan said it was the perfect spot to get away and focus. No distractions, just training, eating, and hiking. I liked the idea. I'd never been the kind of guy who needed constant noise or entertainment. Sometimes you just need silence. We packed heavy. Food, water, a first aid kit, knives, an axe, and a couple of guns. Logan's uncle left a few rifles there for hunting, just in case. It was a long drive, winding up through dirt roads, no houses, no other cabins, nothing but trees and sky. By the time we got there, it was late afternoon. The place looked solid, nothing fancy, just an old wooden cabin in a clearing. Trees wrapped around it on all sides, thick and dark. There was a fire pit out front, a small porch, and an old truck that hadn't been driven in years. Logan unlocked the door, and the inside was just as simple. Wooden walls, a table, some chairs, and bunk beds in the back room. The air was thick with the smell of pine and old wood. The first day was perfect. We cooked over the fire, trained outside, and hiked a few miles before the sun went down. By the time we ate dinner, the stars were out, bright and clear. No light pollution, no city noise, just the crackle of the fire and the wind in the trees. Then, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. That first night, I woke up to a sound outside. It was faint, like footsteps in the leaves. I sat up in bed, listening. Logan was asleep on the other bunk, breathing deep and steady. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer. The cabin was old, but it felt safe enough. Still, I grabbed the knife I kept next to my bed, just in case. I listened for another minute, but the sound was gone. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, Logan mentioned hearing something, too. He didn't think much of it, just said he thought he heard someone moving around outside. But there was nobody out there, just trees and silence. We trained again that morning, pushing through bodyweight circuits, sprinting up the dirt trail near the cabin. By midday, we were both drained, sitting on the porch eating cold chicken and rice. That's when I noticed something. The trees, they felt closer. I know how that sounds. Trees don't just move. But standing on that porch, looking out into the woods, I swear the tree-line looked different, closer than it had the day before. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just tired. The second night, the sounds came back, louder. I woke up around 2 in the morning. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. It was breathing, slow, heavy breathing right outside the cabin wall. I didn't move. I just lay there, gripping the knife, listening. My heart was pounding. The breathing stopped. Then a soft tap against the wall. I sat up fast, my pulse hammering in my ears. I glanced at Logan. He was awake, too, sitting up in the dark, his back straight, his hand resting near his rifle. He heard it. Another tap, then silence. Neither of us moved. We just sat there, staring at the wall. The air inside the cabin felt thick, heavy. I wanted to get up, look outside, but something told me not to. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I must have drifted off. When I woke up, the sun was up and Logan was already outside, looking around. "No tracks," he said. "Nothing." We checked around the cabin, but there was no sign that anything or anyone had been there.
No footprints.
No broken branches. Nothing. The third night was worse. By then, we were both on edge. We sat up late, drinking coffee, keeping the fire burning. We didn't talk about it, but neither of us wanted to go to sleep. But eventually, we did. And that night, something touched the door handle. It wasn't loud, just a soft, careful movement, like someone testing the lock. I held my breath. Logan's bunk creaked as he moved. Then the door handle turned. Slow, deliberate. I shot out of bed, grabbed the rifle, and moved toward the door. Logan was right behind me. Then it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. We waited, standing there in the dark, listening. I felt my pulse in my throat. Then footsteps, moving away, slowly. We didn't chase after it. We didn't open the door. We just waited until the sun came up. At dawn, we packed up. Neither of us said it out loud, but we weren't staying another night. We loaded up the truck and left. The drive back felt longer. The air was thick with something unspoken. Logan didn't talk much, and I didn't ask. When we got back to town, we never really talked about it again. I still train with Logan. We still push each other at the gym, but we never went back to that cabin, and we never will. I had never been the type of person to shy away from a challenge, but when my uncle left me his cabin in the woods of northern Minnesota, I wasn't sure what to make of it. I wasn't even that close to him. He had been more of a distant figure in my childhood, a man who lived alone, who kept to himself. My dad used to say he was the type of person who didn't like people much. Maybe that was why he had chosen to live out here, miles from the nearest town, buried deep in the forest where the roads were nothing more than narrow dirt paths that turned to mud in the rain. I inherited it in 2019, right before winter set in. I had been living in a cramped apartment in the city, working a job that barely covered the bills. The idea of a free place to stay, even if it was isolated, was tempting. I figured I could live there for a while, save some money, and maybe even fix the place up if it needed work. The first time I drove up to the cabin, it took longer than expected. The GPS lost signal an hour before I arrived, and the last stretch of road was a winding mess of trees and shadows. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked exactly how I imagined. Old, but solid. It was built from thick logs, the roof slanted with years of heavy snowfall in mind. The front porch sagged a little and the windows were dirty, but overall it looked sturdy. Inside, the air was stale, but everything was in order. A thick layer of dust covered the wooden furniture, but it was nothing a little cleaning couldn't fix. The cabin had a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area with a stone fireplace. The back door led to a shed, and beyond that, the tree line swallowed everything. It was remote, quiet, and untouched. I spent the first few days settling in. I cleaned, stocked up on supplies, and made sure the generator worked. The place ran on well water, and the only heat source was the fireplace. There was no internet, no phone signal, and only a weak radio connection. I liked the solitude at first. The sound of the wind through the trees, the way the stars looked without the glow of city lights. It was peaceful. But after the first week, little things started to bother me. At night, I would hear noises outside. At first, I assumed it was just the woods. Animals moved through the brush, the wind pushed against the cabin, and branches snapped under the weight of unseen creatures. But then I started noticing things. The back door, which I always locked, would be slightly open in the morning. I convinced myself I had forgotten to latch it properly. Then my tools went missing from the shed. I found them a few days later, neatly placed in the same spot where I had left them, as if someone had borrowed them and returned them. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I had misremembered things. Maybe living alone in the woods was getting to me. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. I didn't move at first. I just lay there, heart pounding, listening. The steps were slow, deliberate. They stopped at the front door. I reached for the old hunting rifle my uncle had kept in the bedroom closet. I wasn't sure if it even worked, but I held it anyway. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. But after a few minutes, the footsteps moved away, disappearing into the woods. The next morning, I found fresh boot prints in the mud outside. I spent the day trying to rationalize it. Maybe a hunter had gotten lost. Maybe someone had been passing through. But it didn't explain why they had stood outside my door in the middle of the night. I started keeping the rifle closer. A few nights later, it happened again. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of slow, heavy breathing just outside my bedroom window. I didn't move. The window didn't have curtains, and the moonlight cast just enough of a glow for me to see the faint outline of something standing there. I couldn't make out a face, but I knew someone was there, watching. I gripped the rifle tighter, barely daring to breathe. Then, after what felt like forever, the shadow moved away. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. More footprints. Someone had circled the entire place multiple times. I thought about leaving, but I had nowhere else to go. The cabin was all I had. But I couldn't ignore what was happening. Someone was out there, watching me, waiting. I started sleeping in shifts, dozing off for only a few hours at a time, waking up at every little sound. Days passed, then a week. I kept the rifle loaded. I started locking the shed, reinforcing the back door, anything to make myself feel safer. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of the door handle rattling. I jumped out of bed, grabbing the rifle. My hands were sweating. The front door was locked, but someone was trying to get in. The handle twisted back and forth, slow and deliberate. I stood in the dark, my back against the wall, rifle raised. Then the sound stopped. I waited, listening. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps moving around the cabin, heading toward the back door. I moved quietly through the house, pressing my back against the walls, staying in the shadows. The back door had a window, and as I peeked through it, I saw a figure standing just outside. It was a man, tall, wearing dark clothes. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could see the glint of something in his hand. A knife. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I raised the rifle and fired a shot through the window. The explosion of sound was deafening in the quiet night. The figure flinched and took off, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At sunrise, I packed my things. I wasn't staying another night. When I got to my truck, I found something that made my stomach turn. A small wooden carving sat on the hood. It was crude, but I could tell what it was. A tiny figure of a man, standing outside a cabin. I left that day and never went back. A month later, I sold the place. I didn't care how much I got for it. I just wanted to be done with it. Whoever had been out there in those woods, whoever had been watching me, waiting, I wasn't going to stick around to find out what they wanted. And I never looked back. I never planned to inherit my grandfather's farm. It just happened. He passed away in late October, leaving behind 200 acres of land, a rundown barn, and a small cabin that had been in the family for decades. The place sat deep in the countryside, far from any town. It wasn't the kind of farm with fresh crops and lively animals. Just overgrown fields, rusting equipment, and a house that had seen better days. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, and I barely had memories of it. Still, I figured I'd check it out, maybe fix it up, maybe sell it. It was late November when I drove out there, a cold wind blowing through the hills as I took the back roads. The drive itself was isolating. Mile after mile of empty land, no streetlights, barely any houses. The last turn led onto a dirt road that was almost washed out, tree branches hanging low enough to scrape my truck. When I finally pulled up, I saw the place hadn't changed much. The barn was still leaning to one side, its red paint almost gone. The fields were nothing but dead grass and weeds. And the cabin, it looked worse than I remembered. The wood was dark and rotting, the front porch sagging. I stepped out, the wind cutting through my jacket, and walked up the creaking steps. The door was unlocked. Inside, dust coated everything. The place smelled stale, like wood and old fabric. The living room had a single chair, a wood stove, and a table that looked like it was about to collapse. The bedroom wasn't much better, just a small bed and a dresser. I spent the next few hours cleaning, brushed away cobwebs, swept the floor, aired out the place. By evening, I had a fire going in the wood stove, and the place felt a little less dead. That's when I noticed something strange. The back door, which led to the fields, was unlocked. I was sure I hadn't touched it. It creaked when it moved, and I would have remembered opening it. But it was just sitting there, slightly ajar. I walked over, looked outside. Just darkness and wind. The fields stretched out to the tree line, nothing but tall grass swaying in the cold air. I told myself I must have missed it when I got here, locked it. That night, I slept with a knife on the table next to me. The next morning, I decided to check out the barn. Inside, the smell of old hay and rust hit me. The roof had holes, and the wooden beams groaned with every gust of wind. Most of the stalls were empty, just broken tools and piles of rotted wood. But in the far corner, something caught my eye. A small, windowless room built into the back wall. I didn't remember it being there. The door was shut, but not locked. When I pushed it open, a rush of damp, stale air came out. The room was small, barely big enough to stand in, and empty except for deep scratch marks on the walls. Long, jagged lines carved into the wood. Some were old, some looked fresh. It was unsettling. I stepped back, closed the door, and left the barn. The rest of the day, I tried to keep myself busy. Chopped some firewood, cleared out junk from the cabin. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place wasn't right. By sunset, the temperature had dropped, and the wind had picked up again. I locked the doors, made sure the windows were shut, and sat by the fire. The only sound was the crackling of the wood and the wind outside. Then, around midnight, I heard something. A creaking noise. Not from inside the cabin. Outside, near the barn. I sat up, listening. The wind made it hard to tell, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was moving out there. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The wind was freezing, cutting through my clothes. I shined the light toward the barn. Nothing, but the door to that small back room. It was open, wide open. I was sure I had shut it earlier. I stood there for a long time, staring at the open door, my breath fogging in the air. Then, slowly, I backed into the cabin and locked the door. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the wind had pushed the door open, that the scratches were just from some old farm animal trapped inside long ago. But that morning, I found something in the dirt outside the cabin. Footprints. Not boot prints. Not shoes. Bare feet. They led from the barn to the cabin's back door. Then they stopped. Just disappeared, as if whoever made them had stepped back into the darkness. I stared at them for a long time, the cold sinking into my bones. Then I went inside, packed my bag, and got ready to leave. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded my truck, I heard something in the woods, a rustling sound just beyond the tree line. I turned, my heart pounding. Nothing but trees, but I knew someone was watching. I got in my truck and drove, fast. By the time I hit the main road, my hands were shaking. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never went back to that farm. I sold it a month later, cheap. Didn't care about the money, just wanted it gone. I don't know what was out there. A drifter? A squatter? Something worse? I'll never know. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the footprints. About the door to that small, windowless room. About the scratches on the walls. And I'm glad I never opened that door again.